Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is an expert of the 1972 Andes flight disaster and is the author of a nonfiction book about the disaster, which is called To Play the Game. His name is John Guiver, and here's my interview with John. John Guiver, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm very happy to be on your podcast.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name is John Guiver. I'm author of the book To Play the Game about the 1972 Andes flight disaster. I had a career actually as a research scientist in artificial intelligence until I retired to write my book. I'm 68. I live in the UK near Cambridge.
As this will help our listeners understand the subject matter of your book better, could you give our listeners a brief overview of the 1972 Andes flight disaster?
Yes, well, it was a rugby team, a group of young men who all knew each other very well. They were from Uruguay. They were flying from Uruguay to Chile to play another team of similar standing. Uruguay is in the east of South America and Chile is in the west. To get from one to the other, you have to cross over the Andes. It's about a 4-hour flight, but they had to stop over actually in an Argentinian city due to bad weather. But the following day, they continued their flight and they hit some bad weather. They got lost. The pilots got lost in the Andes. They lost communication with the ground stations. They hit a couple of big air pockets and came out of the clouds and found that they were heading right towards a mountainous ridge of rock and ice. The pilots tried to clear the ridge, but they didn't quite make it. One of the wings clipped the sort of an outcrop on the ridge, came off. The tail of the plane came off. Some of the passengers fell out the back. The other wing came off, and the fuselage without wings landed on the other side of the ridge and started tobogganing down the mountain. And they went down for about a mile, narrowly missing rocks and other obstacles, and ended up in a remote valley high in the Andes. This was mid-afternoon. Darkness soon came. Extraordinarily, there was 33 out of the original 45 people on board were still alive after that initial accident. By the next morning, some of those people had died of their injuries, but there was still 29 or so still alive. And of course, they expected a rescue. Why wouldn't they? So they waited for a rescue. They cleared out the fuselage, which was giving them shelter, and they found ways of making water and so on. But no rescue came. And they heard on a little transistor radio that they'd found that the search had been called off and wouldn't be resumed for another few months. So they were stuck in high in the mountains, with mountains all around them, with no one looking for them, everyone thinking they were dead. Now, from the outside world's point of view, the story came to life again 72 days after the original accident, when a cattle drover in the Chilean foothills of the Andes spotted a couple of bedraggled young men across a mountain torrent, and they were gesticulating to him and shouting and calling for help. And that precipitated a rescue of both those two boys and the others who were left on the mountain. In all, there were 16 survivors, and the story became famous because they'd had to use the bodies of their friends to survive. But in fact, that aspect is probably one of the least interesting part of their story. It's a an extraordinary story in many different respects.
Now, without spoiling too much of your book, To Play the Game, what is it about?
Well, it's revisiting the story 50 years after the event. The 50th anniversary was December 2022, which is when my book first came out. I wanted to give a richer perspective, both from the community they came from, the country they came from, what happened on the mountain, but also I wanted to talk about those who didn't make it, because the 16 survivors over the years have had a very high profile. They've written memoirs, they've been interviewed numerous times, they give conferences and leadership courses, but it was just a fate of where they decided to sit in the plane as to whether they survived or not. So I always felt right from when I first heard this story that to tell the stories of those who didn't make it, some of whom lived quite a long time on the mountain, was an important aspect of the story to sort of balance it for history and for future generations.
What is the meaning behind the title of your book?
Well, the title To Play the Game comes from a prayer that was said before rugby games. The rugby team, they'd all gone to the same school, high school and middle school, and then they were an old boys rugby team. And the Christian brothers, the Irish Christian brothers who ran the school, had come up with this prayer, and part of it was it's all in this to play the game, to win or lose and be the same, to take the blame, to smile the while, oh help me Lord, to play the game. For when the one great scorer comes to write against your name, he'll not ask if you won or lost, but how you played the game. And so certainly there were people who won on the mountain, and there were people who lost, there were people who came back, and there were people who didn't come back. But it was how they lived their lives, how they worked together as a group that was important.
How did you become deeply interested in the 1972 Andes flight disaster?
Well, like many people, I'd become fascinated by the story after reading the authorized account of the tragedy, which was a book called Alive. A film was made later with the same name, which was by English author Piers Paul Reed. And so I was very familiar with the story. In 2013, I signed up on an expedition to the site of the accident. And through that, I met one of the survivors, a guy called Eduardo Strauch. When I went again a couple of years later, I met, through Eduardo, I met another survivor, Pedro Algorta. And I told him I would translate his memoir, which had just come out. And I went ahead and did that. And that was really the start of my deep involvement, because really in two different levels. First of all, it made me, a serious, a knowledgeable person about the story. And so through Pedro, I met many other people within the community. But also in translating his book, I got in touch with Piers Paul Reed, who had written the book Alive, and he was very interested in my involvement, and he gave me privileged access to his very rich archival information about the story, the interviews he'd done at the time, and many communications, and so on. And so those two sort of threads combined, and I felt I really wanted to start now telling the stories of those who didn't come back in a meaningful way. So in 2019, I had a sabbatical from my research job, and I went out to Uruguay, and I started interviewing many of the families of those who died in the accident. and they were very receptive. They were very happy that someone was telling the story of, of their, in this case, typically their brother, because the parents' generation had, by and large, died out. So these are the brothers and sisters of those who died. And so I had many, many interesting conversations with them and with the survivors, of course, to create the material for the book.
What makes your book different than other books about the same subject?
Well, first of all, I think it's very comprehensive. It starts off looking at the political, the social-cultural environment from which the young men came, which is a very, very interesting time in Uruguayan history. It was a time of the Tupamaros guerrillas, the start of a military dictatorship in Uruguay, and politics. Everyone was talking politics. So that whole environment was a very interesting sort of backdrop to the story. So I talk a lot about that, about the cultural environment they came from. They were a very close-knit community they came from. I talk a lot about the accident, what might have caused the accident, go into a lot of detail there. I talk about the rescue in much more detail than previously. And I tell these stories of those who didn't come back. So I think it's both the breadth of what I'm talking about, but also there's several new angles and contexts for understanding this very rich story.
What now? When a lot of people talk about the 1972 Andes flight disaster, they'll often talk about the stories about those who did survive the disaster. Why is it important to tell the stories of those who didn't survive the disaster?
Well, one of the stories I'm very interested in, one of the survival stories I'm very interested in is Shackleton's open boat voyage. And it always struck me when reading the history of that story that we see the main protagonists, and we know very little about the other people involved, and they all have interesting stories, but they're lost by and large. They're lost to history, and I felt the same thing shouldn't happen with the Andes story. As I said previously, where someone was sitting on the plane, they were walking about in the plane and changing seats and so on. When they finally sat down a few minutes before the accident and put their seatbelts on, where they sat was just a twist of fate. And it could have been easily another 16 people we could be talking about rather than the 16 who survived. So in that sense, that's one sense in which I felt it's important. Another sense is that these, the survival was based on them using the bodies of their friends. So these friends were very important to their survival. And finally, I think it's important to understand that of the 40 passengers on the plane, 26 of them had gone to the same primary and middle school. So it was a remarkably cohesive group. They all knew each other. Everyone in the community knew each other. When the survivors returned, they were living side by side with the parents and the brothers and sisters and the friends of those who didn't survive. And so it was a tragedy that impacted in a very powerful and way this very close-knit community. And so it's important to balance that, I think, to balance the high profile of the survivors with those of their friends who didn't survive.
Was rugby a big part of why the passengers who did survive were able to survive?
Well, it was part of it. I would say it was the values of rugby that, first of all, made the group a surviving group, a group that had the wherewithal to survive, because the school they'd gone to, rugby was really a required part of the curriculum but the aim was to teach values such as teamwork, loyalty, honesty, hard work, service, and to the community, and not individualism. And so that whole culture of values was instilled on all the young men who'd gone to that school. Having said that, the two who finally walked out were rugby players, and so the fitness of the rugby players, many of whom I should say died in the accident, but the two who walked out were rugby players, and so their fitness as well as their values helped them to do that 10-day trek through the Andes.
Is your book To Play the Game self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published?
Well, it's a hybrid publishing model, and in that I went through a small independent publisher who did many of the aspects of publishing that I didn't want to do. But what I did want to do was I wanted to what I told the people I interviewed was that I was going to have complete editorial control over the content of the book, because I didn't want a publisher or an editor coming in and changing things, sensationalizing things, shortening things that were maybe too detailed, and so on. And so I made that promise to everyone I interviewed that I would have full editorial control. And therefore, it wasn't possible for me to go through a mainstream publisher. But I also wanted to go through, through an independent publisher. And one of the conditions we agreed on with the independent publisher was that I would retain both the design of the book and the content of the book, that I would have full editorial control over that.
What was it like to translate the memoirs of a couple of the survivors?
Well, fortunately, the first person whose book I translated, because I didn't speak Spanish. I'd say I did a crash course in Spanish, but fortunately, Pedro speaks quite good English. Now, it's very difficult to translate a book into another language, not your own language. But to translate into your language, you have to understand, precisely what the original author has written. You need to understand their voice in some way, because everyone has a different voice, and then you have to put that into good English. So fortunately, if there was some little bit I didn't understand, some idiom, some special Uruguayan or Argentinian turn of phrase that I didn't understand, I could go to Pedro and he would explain to me. So it was very helpful that he speaks good English. And then he put me in touch with another survivor, a chap called Coche Inciarte, who's a cousin of Pedro's. And he also speaks good English. He passed away, by the way, last year, Coche. He was the second of the 16 survivors to die. But he was both Pedro and Coche, very good friends. And they're very supportive of my efforts, and anything I didn't understand, they would explain, and then I'd be able to put it into good English. So I think these translations are, very good representations of their memoirs. And indeed, Pedro wrote, he thanked me, and he says in the acknowledgements that I'd created a better version of his memoir in English than he had in his original language. So that was very gratifying.
You appeared on 2020, which is a news magazine type program that airs on the commercial TV network ABC here in the United States, for a documentary about the disaster. And what was it like to appear on 2020 for a documentary about the disaster?
It was an interesting experience. There was a London production, a London team that did the filming. So I went down to London. They put me in front of the cameras for About 3 hours, and much. Although the the 2020, I think, is what is an hour and a half. I can't remember. Um, we did a lot of the material that we did appeared in the documentary. Whether it was me saying it or someone else talking about it. But I think I thought the documentary was came out very very well. My only I guess I was a little bit sad that there wasn't more about the people who didn't come back, which had been sort of a big emphasis of mine. But it told the story well, and it was actually a great experience. And there was a documentary also in the UK done by ITN. Which appeared on Channel 5, which was a three-part documentary. And although I didn't actually appear in that one, I was the primary expert on the subject. And in that one, they interviewed several of the survivors, and it was a very different take, but I think a very excellent documentary as well. I don't know if that's viewable in the US, but it's well worth seeing if you can.
John, thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You were an insightful guest, and I got the interview recorded this time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Aaron. It's a real pleasure to be on your podcast. Thank you.
John was an insightful guest. I technically interviewed John twice because the first time I interviewed him for this podcast, I forgot to record the interview to my laptop, so the interview you just listened to is a full redo of the original interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.